Welcome to the Explainer. So, November 11th, 1918. That was supposed to be it, right? The end of the Great War. But what if it wasn't? Today, we're going to dig into how the so-called end of one global conflict actually lit the fuse for the next, creating both a new kind of political violence and a powerful resistance against it.
Okay, let's just start with this quote because, wow, it's from Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz. He was part of the German Freikorps, which were these right-wing paramilitary groups that just exploded after the war. For guys like him, the war wasn't some event with a start and a stop date. It was who they were. It became their whole identity. And that sentiment, that really gets to the heart of the mystery we're looking at today.
And that really is the question, isn't it? The fighting was supposed to stop. Soldiers were supposed to go home, and things were meant to get back to normal. But they didn't. Not really. It was almost like the violence of the battlefields just spilled right over into the politics of the 1920s and 30s. So what happened? Why did the war's brutality just keep going, but in a totally different disguise?
All right, so to really get our heads around this, we've got to start with a really influential theory about the war's psychological fallout. It's an idea that tried to explain how 4 years of just unimaginable violence could permanently scar an entire generation.
It's called the brutalization thesis, from the historian George Moss. The idea, in a nutshell, is that the pure mechanized horror of trench warfare fundamentally rewired society's brain when it came to violence. It wasn't just that soldiers saw awful things. It's that the whole experience created a new, much lower bar for what was considered acceptable violence in everyday politics.
But of course, it's not that simple. I mean, if the war itself was the problem, then why didn't fascism pop up everywhere? Soldiers in Britain and France went through the same kinds of horrors as German soldiers. And here's the real kicker. The overwhelming majority of veterans, even from the countries that lost, they just went home. They went back to their lives. They didn't all run off to join violent political movements.
So, it turns out the war experience by itself wasn't the spark. No. According to historians like Robert Gerwarth, it was the war experience plus the absolute gut punch of a humiliating defeat, of revolution, of seeing your entire empire collapse around you. That was the toxic cocktail that let this new, violent political culture really take root, especially in a place like Germany. So, let's dig into that. Let's look at how this perfect storm of defeat and chaos actually created a brand new and frankly terrifying culture of violence, one that pulled its heroes and its stories straight from the mud of the trenches.
On the one hand, you had thinkers like Ernst Jünger. Now, he was a highly decorated German stormtrooper, but after the war, he didn't write about the trauma. Instead, he basically spun it into this epic tale. He talked about the aesthetics of horror and saw the battlefield as a forge, creating this new, tougher, more real kind of man. To him, the war was a heroic mission.
But then you get the total opposite with artists like Otto Dix. I mean, just look at this. This is no romance. This is a nightmare. It's this apocalyptic, mechanical world where the soldiers are just shapes. You can't even see their faces. They've been stripped of their humanity by the gas masks and the steel helmets. This was the cold, hard reality of it.
In this poster, man, it just perfectly shows how that ugly reality got twisted into a political myth. This is for a veterans group called Stolhelm. And see, that cold, machine-like soldier that Jünger wrote about, he's not a victim anymore. Now he's the hero. He's the steely symbol of a nation being reborn. The horror has been completely repackaged as strength.
And that's exactly how, as one historian put it, the First World War became a laboratory of fascism. All those experiences from the war, they got repurposed. The camaraderie of the trenches was spun into a myth about a nation without class divides, and the idea of violent rebirth gave people hope after a devastating defeat. You were basically looking at the ideological blueprint for the Nazi Party.
Okay, so this new culture of violence is bubbling up, but it wasn't a one-way street, not at all. In fact, it actually sparked a massive and pretty surprising resistance from the ground up.
So, to get what they were fighting against, you have to understand that fascism wasn't just about policy. It was a whole performance, a kind of political bullying. It was all about rejecting democracy, rejecting debate, and celebrating violence. The whole point was to intimidate and bully your opponents into silence.
And what rose up to meet it was anti-fascism. And what's so wild about it is who it brought together. I mean, you had middle-class liberals and revolutionary communists on the same side.
And what united them? It was the shared idea that they had to defend the values of the Enlightenment. Democracy, reason, debate, and basic human dignity. It was a direct counter-performance to fascism.
So this whole movement created what historians call an anti-fascist public sphere. And that sounds academic, but really all it means is that it was this shared space in newspapers, in art, at rallies, where all these different kinds of people came together to fight for democratic culture against what they saw as a threat to its very existence.
A perfect example of this in action is Spain in the 1930s. So they finally get a democratic republic, right? And almost immediately, it's under threat from authoritarian forces inside the country. And you saw this incredible thing happen. People who disagreed on almost everything else, from regular middle-class Republicans to radical workers, they all started to see the defense of their democracy and the fight against fascism as the exact same thing.
But it wasn't just the people on the streets pushing back. The governments themselves, they started wrestling with this really tricky question. How does a democracy defend itself from people who are using its own freedoms to try and kill it?
And this led to this whole new idea called militant democracy. The thinking is pretty simple, really. A democracy can't just be neutral about those trying to destroy it. It has to have legal tools in its back pocket, like being able to ban anti-democratic parties or speech to protect itself before it's too late. And look, this idea didn't just come out of nowhere. It was a direct response to the absolute tragedy of Weimar Germany. People around the world had a front-row seat as the Nazi Party used all the freedoms of that democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to vote, as weapons to tear the whole system down from the inside, while the state just stood by, seemingly unable to stop them.
And that long shadow of Weimar, well, it brings us right to today. It forces us to ask if the hard lessons learned from its collapse and the defenses that were built because of it are still up to the job now.
So here's the puzzle we're left with. That old toolkit of militant democracy, things like banning extremist parties. It was built to fight the kind of fascism we saw in the 1930s. The problem is, today's threats to democracy are often a lot sneakier. They don't always wear uniforms or openly call for a dictator, which makes those old tools a lot harder to use.
And that leaves us with one last big question. The struggle between democratic ideals and the forces that want to tear them down. That fight that blew up after World War I never really went away. But in a world with new and different threats, are the shields we built in the past strong enough to defend us against the weapons of the future? That right there is a question we are all still trying to figure out.